The auctioneer's hammer crashes down with a finality that echoes across the dusty fairground like a gunshot. Sold to the gentleman in the black hat for $12,000. But this isn't cattle being sold, it's 20-year-old Grace Miller standing on that wooden platform in her simple white dress, tears streaming down her face as she stares at the mysterious rancher who just bought her future. The crowd disperses, counting their winnings and losses, but Grace remains frozen, watching as this stranger approaches with eyes that seem to hold secrets deeper than the Texas oil wells. Who is this man who just paid more money than most folks in Dry Creek County see in a lifetime? And why did Grace's own aunt just sell her like livestock at the county's most notorious underground auction? 3 months earlier, Grace Miller was living what most would consider a simple but honest life on her late parents' small farm outside Dry Creek, Texas. The 20-year-old had spent the last 2 years since her parents' tragic car accident trying to keep their modest cotton farm afloat, working from dawn to dusk under the relentless Texas sun. Her calloused hands told the story of someone who knew hard work intimately, and her bright green eyes still held hope despite the mounting bills and threatening letters from the bank. Grace had always been what the locals called pure as Sunday morning. Raised with strong Christian values, never touched alcohol, never been with a man, and spent her Sundays playing piano at the small Baptist church where her mother had taught Sunday school for 15 years. She was the kind of young woman that mothers pointed to as an example for their daughters, with her long auburn hair always neatly braided and her modest dresses that never showed more than was proper. But purity and good intentions couldn't pay the mortgage that her parents had taken out to expand their irrigation system the year before they died. When the final foreclosure notice arrived on a scorching Tuesday in August, Grace knew she had nowhere to turn except to her Aunt Marlene, her father's sister, who lived in the more prosperous part of the county. Marlene Patterson was everything Grace was not, sharp-tongued, calculating, and married to a man who owned 3 successful car dealerships across East Texas. She lived in a sprawling ranch house with more bedrooms than she knew what to do with, drove a brand-new Cadillac, and wore jewelry that caught the light like captured stars. When Grace showed up at her doorstep with nothing but a suitcase and her mother's Bible, Marlene had smiled that practiced smile she used with customers and said, "Of course, honey. Family takes care of family." What Grace didn't know was that Marlene had been watching her niece's situation unfold with the cold calculation of a poker player studying her cards. She'd seen how the young men in town looked at Grace, with a mixture of desire and reverence that came from knowing she was untouchable. She'd noticed how Grace's innocence seemed to glow around her like an aura, making her stand out in a world that had grown increasingly jaded. And most importantly, she'd heard whispers about certain wealthy men who were willing to pay extraordinary sums for what Grace represented. The underground auctions had been happening in Texas for decades, hidden in plain sight at county fairs and livestock shows. To most people, they looked like nothing more than the usual cattle and horse sales. But for those who knew what to look for, certain lots were marked with discreet symbols that indicated a very different kind of merchandise. Young women who had fallen on hard times, who had nowhere else to turn, who could be sponsored by wealthy benefactors willing to pay for the privilege of owning their futures. Marlene had been introduced to this world by her husband's business associate, a man who dealt in what he called rare acquisitions. She'd been told that Grace's particular combination of beauty, innocence, and desperation made her incredibly valuable to the right buyer. The plan was simple. Let Grace stay with them for a few months, gain her trust, and then present the auction as her only option to avoid a life of poverty. For 2 months, Grace lived with Marlene and her husband Wade, helping with household chores and trying to figure out how to rebuild her life. She applied for jobs in town, but the economy was tough, and most positions went to people with experience she didn't have. She tried to be grateful for her aunt's hospitality, but something felt off about the way Marlene watched her sometimes, like she was evaluating livestock. The breaking point came when Marlene sat Grace down in the formal living room on a humid September evening and painted a picture of her future that was deliberately bleak. "Honey, you need to face facts," Marlene said, her voice dripping with false concern. "You've got no money, no job prospects, and no husband prospects either. Not unless you want to end up with some ranch hand who'll work you to death and give you nothing but babies and broken dreams." She then presented what she called a unique opportunity, a chance to meet a wealthy benefactor who would take care of all her needs in exchange for what Marlene termed companionship and domestic service. She made it sound almost respectable, like a well-paid housekeeper position with benefits. What she didn't mention was that this meeting would take place on an auction block, or that Grace would have no say in who her benefactor would be. If you're already rooting for Grace to find her way out of this nightmare, hit the like button to show your support and keep this story unfolding. The morning of the auction, Grace woke up with a sense of dread she couldn't explain. Marlene had insisted she wear the white dress, her mother's wedding dress altered to fit Grace's smaller frame. "You want to make a good impression," Marlene had said, and something about the way she said it made Grace's stomach turn. The drive to the county fairgrounds took 45 minutes through dusty back roads lined with mesquite trees and oil derricks. Grace watched the landscape roll by, remembering happier times when her parents would bring her to the fair every October. She'd ride the Ferris wheel and eat cotton candy until she was sick, never imagining she'd return under such dark circumstances. The fairgrounds were bustling with the usual crowd, ranchers in worn denim and cowboy hats, families with sticky-fingered children, teenagers showing off their prize livestock. But Grace noticed something else. Small groups of well-dressed men who didn't look like they belonged, watching the proceedings with calculating eyes. They wore expensive suits despite the heat and carried themselves with the confidence that came from serious money. Among these men stood someone who would change Grace's life forever, though she didn't know it yet. Jake Morrison was 35 years old, standing 6'3" with weathered hands and sun-weathered skin that spoke of years spent working the land. His black hat was pulled low over dark eyes that seemed to see everything, and there was something about his stillness that made him stand out even in a crowd of stoic ranchers. Jake owned the Triple M Ranch, 15,000 acres of prime Texas real estate that had been in his family for 4 generations. But what made him truly wealthy wasn't the land. It was the natural gas reserves beneath it that had been discovered 3 years earlier. Overnight, Jake had gone from being a comfortable rancher to being worth more than most small countries, though he still wore the same worn boots and drove the same dusty pickup truck he'd had for 10 years. He'd come to the auction for reasons he couldn't fully explain to himself. Someone had mentioned that there would be special lots available, and something about the way it was said had piqued his curiosity. Jake had been alone on his ranch since his fiancée had left him 5 years earlier, unable to handle the isolation and the demands of ranch life. He'd built walls around his heart as sturdy as the fences around his property, but lately the silence had been getting to him. As the regular livestock auction proceeded, Jake found himself studying the crowd, watching for the discreet signals he'd been told to look for. When he saw Grace being led toward the platform, something in his chest tightened. She looked terrified and confused, clearly not understanding what was about to happen to her. Her white dress seemed to glow in the harsh afternoon sun, and her green eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and innocence that hit Jake like a physical blow. The auctioneer, a thin man named Clemens, who Jake had seen at legitimate cattle auctions, began his spiel, but the language was coded. He talked about Grace's pristine condition and guaranteed authenticity, terms that made Jake's jaw clench with anger. This wasn't the first time he'd encountered such depravity, but seeing it happen to someone so clearly unprepared made his blood boil. Other bidders began raising their paddles, and Jake could see the hunger in their eyes. There was Marcus Webb, an oil executive from Houston, known for his collection of young protégés who lived in his mansion like beautiful prisoners. There was Carlton Reeves, a judge from Dallas whose wife had died the year before, and who was looking for what he called a fresh start. And there was Vincent Carruthers, whose reputation for cruelty toward the women in his care was whispered about in certain circles. As the bidding escalated, Jake found himself raising his own paddle, not fully understanding why. Each time another man bid higher, something primal in Jake responded. When Webb bid 10,000, Jake went to 11. When Reeves pushed it to 11.5, Jake countered with 12. The other bidders began to take notice of this mysterious rancher who seemed determined to outbid them all. Grace stood on the platform, watching this surreal scene unfold around her. She still didn't fully understand what was happening. Marlene had told her she was being introduced to potential employers, not that she was being sold to the highest bidder. But as the numbers grew higher and the men's eyes grew hungrier, the horrible truth began to dawn on her. When Jake's final bid of $12,000 was accepted, Grace felt her knees go weak. She watched as this tall stranger approached the platform, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his black hat. Up close she could see that his eyes weren't cruel like the others. They held something that might have been sympathy, or perhaps regret. "Ma'am," he said quietly, tipping his hat. His voice was deep and rough, like gravel over velvet. "My name is Jake Morrison. I own a ranch about an hour from here. I know this isn't what you expected, but I give you my word that I'll treat you with respect." Grace wanted to speak, to ask 1,000 questions, but her voice seemed to have abandoned her. She nodded mutely as Jake paid Clemens in cash, crisp $100 bills that he counted out with the same care he might use to count cattle. The transaction was recorded in a ledger that would disappear within the hour, leaving no official record of what had just transpired. As Jake gently helped Grace down from the platform, she caught sight of Marlene in the crowd. Her aunt was smiling and counting a thick envelope of cash, her commission from the sale. The betrayal hit Grace like a physical blow, and she stumbled. Jake's strong hand steadied her, and when she looked up into his face, she saw something there that gave her the first glimmer of hope she'd felt all day. The drive to Jake's ranch was conducted in relative silence. Grace sat in the passenger seat of his pickup truck, still trying to process what had happened to her. The landscape outside was harsh and beautiful, endless stretches of scrub grass punctuated by oil derricks and the occasional herd of cattle. The late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber, and despite her circumstances, Grace found herself drawn to the austere beauty of it all. Jake's ranch house was nothing like what Grace had expected. Instead of the ostentatious mansion she'd imagined, it was a modest 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch and flower boxes that had been lovingly maintained. The barn and outbuildings were well kept but practical, and there was something about the whole place that spoke of roots and permanence rather than flashy wealth. "I had my housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, prepare a room for you upstairs," Jake said, as he carried Grace's single suitcase onto the porch. "She left dinner in the refrigerator and said to tell you that if you need anything at all, her number is on the kitchen counter." Grace followed him into the house, marveling at the comfortable furniture and family photographs that lined the walls. This didn't feel like the home of a man who bought women at auctions. It felt like a place where families had been raised and lives had been lived with dignity. Jake set her suitcase down at the bottom of the stairs and turned to face her. In the soft light of the living room, Grace could see the lines around his eyes and the premature gray at his temples. He looked like a man who carried heavy burdens, but there was kindness in his expression that made her feel slightly less afraid. "I need you to understand something," he said, his voice gentle but serious. "I didn't buy you to hurt you or to force you into anything you don't want to do. I saw what was happening to you back there, and I couldn't let one of those other men take you home. You're safe here, Grace. I give you my word on that." It was the first time he'd used her name, and hearing it spoken with such gentleness nearly brought tears to her eyes. "But why?" she whispered, finally finding her voice. "Why would you spend so much money on someone you don't even know?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at his land. "I guess I saw something in your eyes that reminded me of who I used to be, before life taught me that the world can be a cruel place. Maybe I thought I could keep that light from going out in you the way it did in me." That night, Grace lay in the comfortable bed in her upstairs room, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of her new reality. Through her window, she could hear the night sounds of the ranch, cattle lowing in the distance, the whisper of wind through the mesquite trees, the occasional call of a night bird. It was peaceful in a way she hadn't experienced since her parents died, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was living in some kind of strange dream. Downstairs, Jake sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, looking out at the stars and wondering what the hell he'd gotten himself into. He'd acted on instinct at the auction, driven by a protective urge he didn't fully understand. Now he had a young woman in his house who had every reason to fear him, and he had no idea how to prove to her that his intentions were honorable. What neither of them knew was that their lives had just become entangled in a web of secrets and danger that stretched far beyond the boundaries of Jake's ranch. Marlene's involvement in the underground auction had been noticed by people who didn't appreciate freelancers operating in their territory. Vincent Carruthers, the man who had been outbid for Grace, wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully, and somewhere in the shadows, men with badges and connections were asking questions about Jake Morrison and wondering if his sudden wealth made him a valuable asset or a dangerous liability. 3 weeks into her stay at the Triple M Ranch, Grace had begun to settle into a routine that felt almost normal. She helped Mrs. Rodriguez with the household chores, tended to a small vegetable garden behind the house, and spent her evenings reading books from Jake's surprisingly extensive library. Jake himself was respectful but distant, treating her more like a house guest than anything else. He never demanded anything from her, never made her feel uncomfortable, and always knocked before entering any room where she might be. But Grace could sense the questions building in both of them. What was this arrangement supposed to be? How long would it last? And what did Jake really expect from her in return for his protection? The turning point came on a Thursday evening when Grace was helping Jake repair a section of fence that had been damaged by his prize bull. She'd insisted on learning ranch work, partly to feel useful and partly because the physical labor reminded her of happier times on her parents' farm. They were working in comfortable silence when a convoy of black SUVs came roaring up the ranch road, kicking up clouds of dust in their wake. Jake immediately tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle he kept mounted in his truck. "Grace, get behind the truck," he said quietly, but his voice carried an authority that made her move without question. The SUVs arranged themselves in a semicircle, and men in expensive suits began emerging from them. Grace recognized Vincent Carruthers immediately. He'd been one of the most aggressive bidders at the auction, and his cold eyes had haunted her nightmares for weeks. With him were several other men she didn't recognize, but their bearing and the bulges under their jackets suggested they weren't here for a social visit. "Morrison!" Carruthers called out, his voice carrying across the ranch yard. "We need to have a conversation." Jake stepped forward, keeping himself between the men and Grace's hiding spot. "This is private property, Carruthers. You and your friends need to get back in those fancy trucks and drive away." Carruthers laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You embarrassed me at that auction, ranch boy. Made me look weak in front of some very important people. That's not something I can let slide." "I paid fair and square," Jake replied, his voice steady despite the odds against him. "The girl stays with me." "See, that's where you're wrong," Carruthers said, signaling to his men. "Because you don't understand how this business really works. That auction was just for show, a way to establish baseline value. The real decisions get made afterward, between people who understand the true nature of power." Grace watched in horror as the men began to spread out, clearly preparing to take her by force. She could see Jake's muscles coil like a spring ready to snap, and she realized that he was prepared to fight all of them to protect her. The man who had bought her at auction was willing to die for her, and she couldn't let that happen. Without thinking, Grace stood up from behind the truck. "Stop," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "I'll go with you willingly if you leave Jake alone." Both Jake and Carruthers turned to stare at her in surprise. Jake's face was a mask of fury and desperation. "Grace, no, get back down." But Grace kept walking forward, her chin raised with a courage she didn't know she possessed. "You want me, right? Then take me. But Jake has done nothing wrong. He bought me legally, and he's treated me with nothing but kindness and respect. If you hurt him, you'll never get what you really want from me." Carruthers smiled, and it was like watching a snake bare its fangs. "What I want from you, little girl, is compliance, and I'll get that whether you cooperate or not." That's when Grace made the decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing toward Carruthers, she suddenly pivoted and ran toward Jake's position. As she moved, she shouted, "Jake, the red button under your truck dash." Jake's eyes widened in surprise. He'd never told Grace about the silent alarm system he'd had installed after discovering natural gas on his property. It was connected directly to the sheriff's department and to his private security firm in Houston. Grace couldn't possibly know about it unless she'd been paying far more attention to her surroundings than anyone realized. Unless she'd been preparing for exactly this kind of situation, Unless there was more to Grace Miller than met the eye. A dangerous decision has been made. What would you do if you were in Grace's boots? Let me know your strategy in the comments below. Jake hit the red button just as Carruthers' men reached them. The silent alarm would bring help, but they were still at least 20 minutes away from the nearest backup. In the meantime, it was Jake and Grace against 6 armed men who had no intention of leaving empty-handed. What happened next would be talked about in Dry Creek County for years to come. Jake Morrison, the quiet rancher who most people considered a gentle giant, transformed into something primal and dangerous. Years of military training that he'd never talked about came flooding back, and he moved with a precision and violence that shocked even Grace. The first man who reached for Grace found himself flat on his back with a broken nose before he knew what had hit him. Jake's fist connected with bone and cartilage with a sound like a branch snapping, and blood spurted across the dusty ground. The second man managed to draw his gun, but Jake was already inside his guard, twisting the weapon away and using the man's own momentum to send him crashing into the side of the truck. Grace watched in fascination and terror as this man who had been so gentle with her unleashed a fury that seemed to come from somewhere deep and dark. But she also noticed something else. Jake was being careful not to kill anyone. He was disabling them, not destroying them, which meant he was still in control despite the violence. Carruthers himself stayed back, letting his men do the dirty work while he watched with clinical interest. "Impressive," he called out as Jake took down a third attacker. "But you can't fight them all, Morrison, and when you tire out, I'll still take the girl. The only difference is that now you'll be in no condition to enjoy your heroic gesture." That's when Grace surprised everyone again. While Jake was engaged with 2 more attackers, she slipped around to the back of Carruthers' position and retrieved something from the toolbox in Jake's truck, a flare gun that ranchers used to signal for help across vast distances. "Mr. Carruthers," she called out sweetly, and when he turned toward her voice, she fired the flare directly at his feet. The bright red projectile struck the ground and erupted in a shower of sparks and smoke, causing Carruthers to leap backward in alarm. More importantly, it created enough chaos and distraction for Jake to finish dealing with the remaining men. But as the smoke cleared and the attackers lay groaning on the ground, Grace and Jake realized their problems were far from over. Carruthers was speaking rapidly into a cell phone, and his words were chilling. "Phase 1 failed. Initiate Phase 2. Burn it all down." Within minutes, they could see smoke rising from multiple points around the ranch. Carruthers' backup plan was to destroy everything Jake owned, if he couldn't have Grace. Hay barns, equipment sheds, and even sections of pasture were going up in flames as hidden incendiary devices activated across the property. Jake looked at his burning ranch with an expression of devastating loss, and Grace felt her heart break for him. This man had sacrificed everything to protect her, and now he was watching his family's legacy turn to ash and smoke. But then something extraordinary happened. The sound of helicopters filled the air, and multiple aircraft descended on the ranch like mechanical angels. Men in tactical gear rappelled down on fast ropes, moving with military precision to surround Carruthers and his remaining forces. At the same time, fire suppression helicopters appeared on the horizon, already moving to combat the blazes spreading across Jake's land. Grace stared in amazement as the cavalry arrived in force. But this wasn't the local sheriff's department or even the state police. These were federal agents, and they moved like they'd been planning this operation for months. The lead agent, a woman in her 40s with steel-gray hair and ice-blue eyes, approached Jake with something that looked almost like respect. "Mr. Morrison," she said, extending her hand. "Agent Sarah Chen, FBI. We've been tracking Carruthers' operation for 2 years. You just helped us catch him red-handed." Jake shook her hand but looked confused. "I don't understand. How did you know to come here? I only hit the panic button 20 minutes ago." Agent Chen smiled, and for the first time since the chaos began, Grace saw something that looked like hope. "Mr. Morrison, meet Grace Miller, also known to us as Agent Grace Sullivan, one of our most promising undercover operatives. If this twist caught you by surprise, subscribe now and hit that notification bell, because the resolution of this Texas tale is about to get even more unbelievable." The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. Grace, the innocent young woman he'd been protecting, the pure soul he'd bought at auction to save from predators, was actually an FBI agent who'd been working undercover to bring down an interstate human trafficking ring. "I'm sorry, Jake," Grace said, and for the first time since he'd known her, her accent was different, more educated, less rural Texas drawl. "I know this is a shock, but I need you to understand that everything I told you about my parents, about losing the farm, about my aunt, all of that was true. The only lie was who I really work for now." Agent Chen stepped forward to explain. Grace's parents really did die in a car accident 2 years ago. She really did lose the family farm. But instead of turning to her aunt for help, she was recruited by the Bureau. Her background, the innocence, the desperation, the complete lack of criminal connections, made her perfect for this operation. Jake looked between the two women, trying to process this information. "So the auction was real," Grace confirmed. "Marlene really did sell me, and those men really were bidding on me. But I was wired for sound and video the entire time. We've been building a case against this trafficking network for 2 years, and we needed someone on the inside who could document the entire process." "But why didn't you tell me?" Jake asked, and there was hurt in his voice that cut Grace deeper than any physical wound. "Because I couldn't be sure what kind of man you really were," Grace admitted. "For all I knew, you were part of their network. Some of the buyers at these auctions appear to be legitimate businessmen, but are actually connected to organized crime. I had to maintain my cover until I was certain you weren't a threat." Agent Chen consulted her tablet and frowned. "Actually, Mr. Morrison, that raises an interesting question. Our financial investigation shows that you paid for Grace with cash that can be traced to several offshore accounts that are connected to some very sophisticated money laundering operations." Jake's face went pale. "That's impossible. That money came from my gas wells." "Did it?" Agent Chen asked. "Or did it come from the company that's been buying your natural gas? Lone Star Energy Solutions, a company that, according to our investigation, is a front for one of the largest criminal enterprises in the Southwest." The implications hit both Jake and Grace simultaneously. Jake's newfound wealth, the wealth that had allowed him to outbid career criminals at the auction, was itself criminal in origin. He'd been an unwitting money launderer for the very organization that Grace had been sent to investigate. "Jesus," Jake whispered, sinking down onto the tailgate of his truck. "I had no idea." Grace moved toward him instinctively, then stopped herself. The lines between her real feelings and her undercover persona had become hopelessly blurred over the past few weeks. She'd started this assignment thinking of Jake as a potential criminal, but somewhere along the way, she'd begun to care for him as a man. "There's more," Agent Chen continued relentlessly. "The reason Carruthers was so determined to get Grace back wasn't just about saving face. Our intelligence suggests that he suspected she might be law enforcement. This attack on your ranch was as much about eliminating a potential witness as it was about recovering human property." As if summoned by her words, another helicopter touched down in the ranch yard. This one carried a man Grace recognized with a chill of genuine fear, Marcus Webb, the oil executive from Houston, who had been bidding against Jake at the auction. But now he wasn't dressed like a businessman. He wore tactical gear and carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to giving orders that meant life or death. "Agent Sullivan," he called out as he approached, flanked by men who were clearly not federal agents. "I'm disappointed. We had such high hopes for you." Agent Chen immediately drew her weapon, but her team was outnumbered and outgunned by Webb's forces. "FBI, stand down," Webb laughed. "Agent Chen, I'm afraid you've been operating under some serious misconceptions about who's really in charge here. The trafficking network you've been investigating, it's been under federal protection for the past 5 years, my federal protection." The truth crashed over Grace like a cold wave. Webb wasn't just a criminal. He was a corrupt federal official who had been using his position to protect the very crimes she'd been sent to investigate. Her entire operation had been compromised from the beginning. "You're going to walk away from here," Webb continued, "and you're going to file a report stating that Vincent Carruthers was the head of a small local trafficking operation that has now been neutralized. There will be no mention of interstate commerce, no mention of federal jurisdiction, and definitely no mention of Lone Star Energy Solutions." "And if we refuse?" Agent Chen asked, though Grace could see in her eyes that she already knew the answer. Webb smiled coldly. Then Jake Morrison dies in a tragic ranch fire. Grace Sullivan disappears forever, and you have a very unfortunate accident on your way back to Houston. Your choice. That's when Grace made the second life-changing decision of the day. Instead of accepting defeat, she looked at Jake and saw something in his eyes that told her he was thinking the same thing she was. They'd been backed into a corner by forces more powerful and corrupt than either of them had imagined. But they weren't beaten yet. Actually, Grace said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins, I think you're the one who's been operating under misconceptions, Mr. Webb. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small device that looked like nothing more than a hearing aid. This is a live transmitter. Everything you've said in the past 5 minutes has been broadcast to every major news network in Texas, as well as to the FBI Director's office in Washington and the Attorney General's personal cell phone. Webb's face went white, then red with rage. You're bluffing. Am I? Grace asked. Jake, would you mind checking your phone? I'm betting you've got about 50 missed calls right now. Jake pulled out his phone, and his eyes widened. 63 missed calls. FBI, Texas Rangers, Houston PD, and... He paused, staring at the screen. The governor's office. Webb realized he'd been outmaneuvered, but men like him didn't go down quietly. Kill them all, he ordered his men. We'll deal with the fallout later. But as his men raised their weapons, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Not 1 or 2 patrol cars, but what sounded like every law enforcement vehicle in East Texas converging on the Triple M ranch. Grace's gambit had worked. By broadcasting Webb's confession live, she'd created a situation where he couldn't simply make them disappear. The next few hours were a blur of arrests, evidence collection, and debriefings. Webb and his entire network were taken into custody, along with Carruthers and the remnants of his organization. Jake found himself cleared of any wrongdoing. He'd been an unwitting victim of the money laundering scheme, not a participant. As the sun set over the ranch, Grace and Jake found themselves alone for the first time since the chaos began. The fires had been extinguished, and most of the damage was cosmetic. The important things, the house, the livestock, the heart of the ranch, had survived. So what happens now? Jake asked, looking at Grace with eyes that held a mixture of admiration and uncertainty. Grace was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the land she'd come to love during her weeks undercover. I don't know, she admitted. My assignment is over, the case is closed. I suppose I go back to Washington and wait for my next undercover operation. And us? Jake asked. Was any of it real? Grace turned to look at him, and Jake could see tears in her eyes. All of it was real, she said. The connection between us, the way you protected me, the way you made me feel safe, that was all real. I may have lied about who I work for, but I never lied about how I feel about you. Jake stepped closer, reaching out to cup her face in his calloused hands. Then stay, he said simply. The ranch needs rebuilding, and I could use a partner who knows how to handle herself in a crisis. Grace smiled through her tears. Are you offering me a job, Mr. Morrison? I'm offering you a life, Jake replied, if you want it. Before Grace could answer, both of their phones buzzed simultaneously. Jake looked at his screen and frowned. It's from Agent Chen. She says there's something we need to know about Lone Star Energy Solutions, something big. Grace checked her own message and felt her blood run cold. Jake, according to this, Lone Star Energy was just a front company. The real money behind your gas wells comes from something called Phoenix International. And Phoenix International just put a $10 million bounty on both our heads. As they stared at each other in the gathering darkness, both of them realized that their ordeal was far from over. Webb's arrest had been just the tip of the iceberg, and forces even more powerful and dangerous than they'd imagined were now mobilizing against them. In the distance, the sound of helicopters could be heard approaching once again, but this time neither Jake nor Grace was sure if they were bringing salvation or something much worse. 6 months later, Grace and Jake were still alive, which was more than many people had expected. The Phoenix International investigation had led to arrests in 12 states and 3 countries, completely dismantling what turned out to be one of the largest criminal enterprises in North American history. Grace's courage in maintaining her cover and Jake's determination to protect her had been instrumental in bringing down a network that had destroyed thousands of lives. The Triple M Ranch had been rebuilt, better than before. Insurance money, combined with Jake's legitimate gas well income, once it was properly cleaned and accounted for, had allowed them to modernize the operation while maintaining its traditional character. Grace had officially retired from undercover work and now served as a consultant to the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force, helping train new agents while building a new life in Texas. The relationship between Grace and Jake had evolved into something neither of them had expected when they first met on that auction platform. It wasn't the desperate gratitude of a rescued victim toward her savior, nor was it the protective instinct of a strong man toward a vulnerable woman. Instead, it had become a partnership built on mutual respect, shared trauma, and the kind of deep understanding that comes from facing genuine evil together and refusing to let it win. They had learned that strength doesn't always come from physical power or official authority. Sometimes it comes from the courage to do what's right, even when you're terrified. From the wisdom to see through deception, to the truth underneath, and from the faith to trust another person completely, even when everything you thought you knew about them turns out to be wrong. Grace had discovered that her small-town upbringing and her genuine faith weren't weaknesses to be overcome in her law enforcement career. They were strengths that allowed her to connect with victims and maintain her humanity in the face of unspeakable cruelty. Her purity, which Marlene had seen as something to be exploited and sold, had actually been her greatest weapon against the corruption that surrounded her. Jake had learned that his quiet life on the ranch hadn't made him naive or unprepared for the wider world. The values his family had instilled in him, loyalty, integrity, and the willingness to stand up for those who couldn't defend themselves, had proven more valuable than all the criminal money that had temporarily flowed through his accounts. His willingness to sacrifice everything to protect someone he barely knew had revealed a character that even he hadn't fully understood. The moral of their story wasn't complicated, but it was profound. In a world where people are treated as commodities to be bought and sold, where corruption reaches into the highest levels of government, where the innocent are preyed upon by those with power and money, the greatest weapon against evil is not violence or wealth or authority. It's the simple human decision to value other people more than yourself, to choose truth over comfort, and to believe that one person's courage can make a difference. Grace and Jake had both started their journey believing they were powerless. She as a desperate young woman with no options, he as an isolated rancher with money he didn't understand. But they had discovered that real power comes from the connections we make with other people, the stands we take for what's right, and the willingness to sacrifice for something greater than ourselves. The Texas landscape that surrounded them had become more than just a backdrop for their story. It represented the enduring strength of people who work the land, who build their lives on foundations that go deeper than money or fashion, who understand that some things are worth fighting for regardless of the cost. The vastness of the sky and the harshness of the terrain had taught them both that they were small in the grand scheme of things, but that their choices still mattered enormously. As Grace stood on the porch of their rebuilt ranch house, watching Jake work with the horses in the corral, she reflected on how much had changed since that terrifying day at the auction. She wore a simple gold band on her finger now. Jake had proposed on the 6-month anniversary of the day they met, not with diamonds or elaborate ceremony, but with a quiet conversation on the same porch where he'd first promised her safety. The wedding had been small, held at the little Baptist church where Grace's mother had once taught Sunday school. Agent Chen had served as maid of honor, and Jake's ranch hands had been his groomsmen. It wasn't the kind of wedding that made the society pages, but it was the kind that brought tears to the eyes of everyone who attended, because everyone could see that this was a love forged in fire and tempered by truth. Their life together wasn't perfect. Grace sometimes woke up screaming from nightmares about the auction, and Jake still struggled with guilt over how close he'd come to losing everything due to his unwitting involvement with criminals. But they had learned to face their demons together, to be honest about their fears and their flaws, and to build their relationship on the solid foundation of shared values rather than the shifting sand of passion alone. The ranch prospered under their joint management. Grace's law enforcement background made her excellent at organizing and planning, while Jake's deep knowledge of the land and livestock provided the practical foundation for their success. They employed several local families, providing good jobs in a part of Texas where economic opportunities were scarce. They also quietly funded a scholarship program for young women who had lost their parents, ensuring that others in Grace's former situation would have options beyond desperation. Most importantly, they had become a symbol of hope for other victims of trafficking and corruption. Grace regularly spoke at law enforcement conferences, sharing her story and helping train officers to recognize the signs of modern slavery. Jake worked with ranchers' associations to help identify and report suspicious activities on rural properties. Together, they had turned their trauma into a tool for protecting others. The Phoenix International investigation had revealed the true scope of the criminal enterprise they had helped bring down. It wasn't just human trafficking, it was a complete shadow economy built on exploitation, violence, and corruption. The money laundering operation that had entangled Jake was just one tentacle of an octopus that reached into legitimate businesses, government agencies, and even charitable organizations across multiple continents. But the investigation had also revealed something else: the power of ordinary people to resist evil when they choose to stand together. Grace's courage in maintaining her cover, Jake's determination to protect her, Agent Chen's refusal to compromise her integrity, and even Mrs. Rodriguez's quiet support had all been essential pieces in bringing down an organization that had seemed untouchable. As the sun set over the Triple M Ranch on this particular evening, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful to be real, Grace and Jake knew that their story was both ending and beginning. The immediate danger was over. The criminals were in prison and their life together was secure. But they also knew that evil would always exist in the world, that there would always be people who saw others as objects to be used rather than souls to be respected. The difference was that now they knew what they were capable of when they stood together. They had faced the worst that humanity had to offer and had chosen to respond with love instead of hate, with courage instead of fear, with hope instead of despair. They had learned that purity isn't about innocence or naivety. It's about maintaining your values and your compassion, even when the world tries to corrupt you. Their ranch would continue to be a place of refuge and strength, not just for them, but for anyone who needed to remember that good people still existed, that integrity still mattered, and that love could still triumph over evil when backed by courage and determination. The moral of Grace and Jake's story would be told and retold in Dry Creek County for generations to come, becoming part of the local folklore that helped define what it meant to be Texan. It was a story about the power of doing right when doing wrong would be easier, about the strength that comes from vulnerability honestly shared, and about the truth that real wealth isn't measured in money, but in the depth of your relationships and the integrity of your choices. Most of all, it was a story about hope, the hope that no matter how dark the world might seem, no matter how powerful evil might appear, there are always people willing to stand up and fight for what's right. And sometimes, if they're brave enough and lucky enough, they might just win. And there you have it, the incredible true story of Grace Miller and Jake Morrison, two souls who found each other in the darkest of circumstances and proved that love, courage, and integrity can triumph over even the most sophisticated evil. Their journey from that terrifying auction to their peaceful ranch shows us that sometimes the people who save us are the ones we least expect, and sometimes the strength we need has been inside us all along. If this story moved you, if it made you believe in the power of good people to make a difference, then I need you to do something for me right now. Hit that like button to show your support for stories that celebrate the triumph of good over evil. Click subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss another tale from the heart of Texas. These stories matter because they remind us of who we can be when we choose courage over comfort. But most importantly, I want to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever had to make a choice between doing what's safe and doing what's right? Do you believe that one person's courage can really change the world? And what do you think happened to Marlene after Grace's true identity was revealed? Share your thoughts, your own stories of courage, and let's build a community of people who believe that good can win when good people refuse to stay silent. Thank you for spending over an hour with me today, diving deep into this tale of redemption and love. Your time is precious, and I'm honored you chose to spend it here. Before you go, check out the videos appearing on your screen right now. more incredible stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, more proof that heroes walk among us every day. Remember, in a world that often seems dominated by darkness, you have the power to be someone's light. You have the courage to stand up for what's right. And you have the strength to make a difference, just like Grace and Jake did on that dusty ranch in Texas. Until next time, keep believing in the power of good people to change the world. Because that's exactly what you are. Good people with the power to change the world. One choice, one stand, one act of courage at a time. God bless, and I'll see you in the next story.